This video was brought to you by Brilliant, and the first 200 people to use the link below will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Over the last few days, you've likely seen reports about protests in Russia, as well as stories about Russian troops abandoning their posts. It seems then, based on these accounts at least, that Putin's losing the information war domestically. His own people aren't happy with the invasion of their neighbour, or at least that's what you might think. But recent polling, which is admittedly unreliable, saw Putin's approval rating actually rise by 11 points since the beginning of this. So let's unpack what Putin's information or misinformation strategy actually is, if it's working, and what this tells us about the likely future of this conflict. Anyway, before we get into anything else, let's start by unpacking Putin's pitch. Why he says that he's doing all of this. To get our best insight, it's probably worth looking at the speeches that Putin made towards the beginning of all of this, explaining to his people, and to a lesser extent the world, what this offensive was all about. There are three main elements to Putin's story that we ought to consider. Firstly, Putin alleges that Ukraine isn't a legitimate country, arguing that it was founded by Russia and as such is both legitimately part of Russia and ought to be under Russian control. Secondly, Putin claims that Ukraine has been hijacked by the West. His narrative dictates that the West are using Ukraine as a way of getting to Russia. They're forcing Ukraine to join NATO to bring the alliance even closer to Putin, and close in on his regime more generally. Thirdly, he says that to achieve this objective, the West has installed a Western-backed puppet government in Ukraine, with him specifically taking aim at President Zelensky, who, according to Putin, is many things, including a drug addict, a thug, and a neo-Nazi. Those three tenets ultimately make up Putin's core argument. He's claiming that he's not trying to take over Ukraine, but instead protect their neighbours and brothers. Because of their common history and culture, Putin is merely lending a hand and protecting the country from a Western takeover and neo-Nazi rule. This whole theory of Ukraine might sound a little laughable to you, so perhaps unsurprisingly, this narrative hasn't been all that successful outside of Putin's domestic Russian audience. Most of the international community sees Ukraine as a sovereign, independent state with a legitimate and democratically elected government. So how did Putin and the Russian state lose this information war, something they're supposed to be good at? Well, let's separate this video into two further parts. Russia's international information campaign and their domestic information campaign. Let's start with the international information campaign. As we just mentioned, Putin has been almost entirely unsuccessful on this front. Almost no one in the international community has bought his narrative that Russia is conducting a minor special military operation in order to depose a Nazi regime in Kyiv. Most of the international community actually seems to be rather sympathetic towards Ukraine. This was reflected in the recent UN resolution condemning Russian aggression, where 141 states voted in favour and just 5 against. Those 5 states were Russia, Belarus, Syria, North Korea and Eritrea. So it seems that even China has challenged Putin's narrative, with their foreign minister last Wednesday describing the conflict as a war. So how did this happen? Well, it's partly because the West, and especially the US, fought a good information war in the build-up to the invasion, declassifying intelligence in real time to push back against Russia's narrative. Western intelligence warned months in advance that Putin was planning an invasion, and while Putin denied these reports and accused the West of anti-Russian hysteria, which has meant he's lost a fair bit of international credibility when he actually went ahead and invaded. It's also possible that these warnings by Western intelligence about false flag operations discouraged Russia from actually trying one, which meant that Putin had to rely on his implausible story about Nazis in Kyiv rather than making up some other excuse. But they've also been failing because since the war began, Ukraine has fought their own information war, which has been extraordinarily effective. Social media has been flooded with videos of Zelensky in army fatigues, and stories of heroic bravery from Ukrainian troops, or conversely, stories of immense cruelty from Russian forces. Quotes like, "I need ammunition, not a ride," and "Go f*** yourself, Russian warship," are known world over. Russia has been unable to put out equivalent war propaganda because state media is sticking with the special military operation narrative, one that no one's really buying. So you get the point. Russia is losing the international information war. But what about within Russia? Well, here he's having some success. The most recent polling we have found that 60% of Russians blame NATO for the conflict, and only a third of Russians actually oppose the war. But this should be somewhat unsurprising given the grip that Putin has on Russia's media, which has long been dominated by state-owned enterprises. Putin has even further cracked down on the press, shutting down a whole load of independent news outlets and introducing a new ban on so-called fake news, which carries a maximum prison sentence of 15 years. There have even been reports of policemen spot-checking people on the street in Moscow and demanding to see their private messages. Nonetheless, though, this isn't the unanimity that Putin's used to, and there have been unprecedented anti-war protests across Russia. On Sunday alone, 4,500 Russians were arrested in more than 50 cities across the country. And while Putin might have convinced the majority of Russians that he's fighting a just war, young, educated Russians, who, not coincidentally, are less reliant on state media, have been leaving the country in droves. Polling conducted between February 2017 and 21st, the week before the invasion, found that 43% of Russians between the ages of 18 and 24 already wanted to leave the country, with a 44% plurality citing economic reasons. The war has drastically accelerated this trend, and today flights out of Russia are more than 10 times their normal prices, and Google searches in Russia for flights, visas, immigration, and political asylum have all shot up. And in fact, Finnish trains from St. Petersburg to Helsinki, which are usually relatively empty, have been packed with Russian travellers since February 27th. VR Group, a Finnish train company, told The Economist that they plan to double the number of daily trains in order to accommodate the growing demand from Russian passengers. While this might not sound like massive news, this represents a significant brain drain. The people leaving Russia are disproportionately young and educated, and will also be the most economically valuable. And given the state of the Russian economy at the moment, this is talent they just can't really afford to lose. Anyway, you get the point. While Putin might be successfully controlling the narrative within Russia, there's still been an impressive exodus since the invasion began, which ought to be very worrying to Mr. Putin. If you feel like you're experiencing your own personal brain drain, then you should check out the sponsor of this video, Brilliant. Brilliant is an online STEM learning platform which turns complex subjects into fun and interactive experiences. You might not expect this, but I actually did a computer science degree, and jumping into Brilliant to refresh my skills was incredibly exciting and engaging. But you don't need that kind of background. If you just want to spend a bit of time building your programming skills, then you can do it right away, with no long boring lectures like I had to sit through. Sorry to my former university. But instead, you can learn through interactive games and puzzles. There's something at all levels too, with more advanced courses on things like neural networks or even quantum computing. And it's not just computer science either. Brilliant has loads of interactive STEM courses that you can get hands-on with. Just pick a course you're interested in and get started. And don't worry, they're all designed by award-winning instructors and built on the principle of active learning. So you're gaining STEM knowledge by actually doing it. Essentially then, Brilliant helps you learn new things and sharpen your skills. So if you want to improve with STEM, then sign up to Brilliant at brilliant.org/TLDREU. And the first 200 people to do so will get 20% off the annual premium subscription.